The world had already begun its descent into madness when Connor Reeves started his diary. He wasn't a writer, nor did he believe anyone would ever read his words. But when civilization fell, when the streets of Chicago were no longer filled with the hum of traffic but the groans of the undead, the pages of his notebook became his only outlet for sanity. It all started with the Chicago flu. That's what they called it at first, just another seasonal virus. The government downplayed it. News anchors reassured the public. But then people stopped getting sick and started getting hungry. Not for food. Not for water. For flesh. Connor had seen the first real sign of the apocalypse unfold in front of his apartment complex. An old man, barely able to walk, collapsed on the sidewalk. A kind woman knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Then, with inhuman speed, the old man's body lurched forward, his teeth sinking deep into her throat. Her scream curdled the air, but it only lasted a second before her voice was drowned out by the sound of tearing flesh. Connor had slammed his window shut and locked his door, his heart hammering. In the days that followed, emergency broadcasts flooded the airwaves, warning people to stay indoors. But panic spread faster than the infection. The city burned. The police were overrun. The military arrived and then vanished just as quickly, their bodies swelling the ranks of the undead. Now, 2 weeks later, Connor sat in a ransacked grocery store, scribbling into his diary by the dim glow of a flashlight. He had ventured out to scavenge, risking the streets infested with shambling corpses. He thought the store would be empty, but he wasn't alone. A noise, metal clanking against metal, made him freeze. Connor shut his notebook, stuffing it into his backpack. He grabbed the knife strapped to his belt and crouched low. Someone else was in here. He peered around a shelf, his breath slow and steady. That's when he saw her. A girl, no older than 16, stuffing protein bars into a bag. She was thin, too thin, but her movements were sharp, deliberate. She wasn't a mindless looter. She was a survivor. But then, behind her, movement. A shadow rose from behind the counter, one of them. A walker. Its decayed, hollow eyes locked onto her. Connor acted before he could think. "Behind you," he shouted. The girl spun, just in time to see the monster lunge. She dove sideways as the walker crashed into the shelves. Cans of soup clattered to the floor. Connor sprinted forward, knife in hand. The walker snarled, snapping its rotten teeth at the girl. She scrambled backward, fumbling for a weapon. Connor didn't hesitate. He drove his knife straight into the side of its skull, feeling the sickening crunch of bone and brain matter. The walker collapsed, dead for good this time. The girl stared at him, wide-eyed, her breathing heavy. Then she grabbed a crowbar from her bag and pointed it at him. "Stay back." Connor raised his hands. "Relax. I just saved your life." "Yeah? Maybe I didn't need saving." He let out a short laugh. "Right. You had that under control." She narrowed her eyes, then sighed, lowering her weapon. "Thanks." Connor nodded. "Name's Connor." She hesitated before answering. "Lucy." An awkward silence stretched between them. In the world before, they would have gone their separate ways. But this wasn't the world before. "You alone?" he asked. Lucy hesitated again. "Not anymore," she said, stuffing the last of the food into her bag. Connor glanced at the glass doors of the store. The noise had probably drawn more walkers. It wasn't safe here anymore. "I have a place," he said. "It's not much, but it's secure." Lucy studied him, then nodded. "Fine. But if you try anything, I'll crack your skull open." Connor smirked. "Fair enough." As they slipped out of the store and into the ruined streets, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Survival wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about trust. And in a world where the dead walked, trust was more dangerous than the infected. The streets were quieter than usual, but that only made them more dangerous. Connor led Lucy through the alleyways, avoiding the main roads where the undead shuffled aimlessly, drawn to movement and sound like moths to a flame. He had survived this long by staying unnoticed. No loud fights. No unnecessary risks. But bringing Lucy along changed things. She was quick on her feet, sure, but she was also cautious, distrustful. Connor understood that. Trusting the wrong person in this new world could get you killed faster than a walker bite. His hideout wasn't much, a second-floor apartment above a boarded-up hardware store. The windows were reinforced with scavenged wood, and the entrance was barricaded with a heavy metal shelving unit. It wasn't perfect, but it had kept him alive. Once inside, Connor relocked the door behind them. Lucy scanned the small space, her expression unreadable. "This where you've been holed up?" she asked. Connor nodded. "For now." She tossed her bag onto the couch and sat, stretching her legs. "Not bad. I've seen worse." Connor took off his jacket and grabbed a bottle of water from his supplies, handing it to her. She eyed him warily before snatching it up and drinking in quick gulps. "You got anyone else?" she asked between sips. Connor hesitated. "No. It was my brother and me at first, but he didn't make it." Lucy's gaze flickered with something, understanding, maybe. "Sorry." "Yeah. Me too." Silence settled between them, the kind that came when two survivors realized they were still human enough to care. But there was no time for grief anymore. "You been alone this whole time?" Connor asked. Lucy shrugged. "I was with a group for a while. Didn't work out." Connor didn't press. Everyone had their own story, and most of them ended in tragedy. Just as he was about to ask another question, a sound echoed from outside. A scream, sharp and desperate. Connor and Lucy locked eyes. "Survivor?" Lucy whispered. "Maybe. Or bait." They both knew what that meant. Some people weren't worth saving. Some lured others out, preying on their compassion, only to rob them blind, or worse. The scream came again. Closer. Followed by guttural groans. Connor's grip tightened on his knife. "Stay here." Lucy scoffed. "Not a chance." She grabbed her crowbar and followed him to the window. Down below, in the street, a man sprinted for his life. He wasn't alone. 3 walkers pursued him, their decayed limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions. His face was twisted in terror, and fresh blood stained his torn hoodie. "Damn it," Connor muttered. Lucy exhaled. "We should help him." Connor clenched his jaw. Helping people was dangerous. The man could be bitten. He could be a threat. But leaving him to die. The man tripped, crashing to the pavement. The walkers closed in. Connor moved before he could talk himself out of it. He grabbed his crossbow, an old hunting relic he had scavenged, and took aim. Twip! An arrow shot through the air, striking the closest walker in the skull. It collapsed instantly. The second walker turned toward the noise. Lucy was already moving. She flung open the window and hurled a brick straight down. It smashed into the undead's head, knocking it off balance. "Come on, get up!" Connor shouted at the man. The stranger scrambled to his feet, his wide eyes darting toward them. "Back door!" Connor yelled, pointing. "Now!" The man bolted toward the alley as the last walker lumbered after him. Connor and Lucy didn't waste time. They sprinted to the back entrance, unbarring the door just as the man stumbled in, gasping for breath. The last walker followed. Lucy swung her crowbar with a savage grunt, caving in its skull. The body dropped with a sickening thud. The man doubled over, panting. "Oh, God. I thought I was dead." Connor studied him, still gripping his knife. The guy looked rough, dirty, bleeding, but alive. Lucy crossed her arms. "Who are you?" The man straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Jackson. Name's Jackson." Connor wasn't sure if saving him had been the right call. But in a world like this, the only thing worse than dying alone was living that way. And something told him their fight was just beginning. Connor didn't trust Jackson. Not yet. Saving someone was one thing, letting them stay was another. Jackson slumped against the wall, still catching his breath. Up close, he looked even worse. His hoodie was torn, his jeans were streaked with mud, and blood stained his left sleeve. Lucy noticed it, too. She gripped her crowbar tighter. "You're bleeding." Jackson raised his hands. "Not bitten. I swear." Connor exchanged a glance with Lucy before stepping forward. "Show me." Jackson hesitated for only a second before rolling up his sleeve. A deep gash ran along his forearm, oozing blood. But there were no bite marks. Just a nasty cut, likely from a fall or a fight. Lucy relaxed, slightly. "You got lucky," Connor muttered. He grabbed an old med kit from his stash, tossing it to Jackson. "Clean that up." Jackson caught it, exhaling in relief. "Thanks, man." "Seriously." Connor leaned against the table, arms crossed. "What were you doing out there?" Jackson grimaced as he dabbed disinfectant on his wound. "Looking for supplies. My last camp got overrun. It was just me left." He hissed at the sting, shaking his head. "Figured I'd take my chances in the city." "Bad call." Connor and Lucy exchanged a look. It was hard to know who to believe these days. "Where was your camp?" Lucy asked. "South side, near the old train yard." Connor narrowed his eyes. "That place is a death trap." Jackson let out a dry chuckle. "Tell me about it." He wrapped his arm in gauze before glancing between them. "Look, I get it. You don't trust me. I wouldn't trust me either. But I don't have anywhere else to go." Connor stayed silent. He had survived this long by being careful. Taking in a stranger was a risk. "You got food?" Lucy asked. Jackson sighed. "A couple cans. Not much." Lucy crossed her arms. "Then what do you bring to the table?" Jackson scoffed. "What is this, an interview?" Connor didn't smile. "Yeah. It is." Jackson studied them both, then sighed. "I can handle myself. I've been through worse. I know how to move quietly, track supplies, set traps. I'm not dead yet. That's gotta count for something." Connor considered this. Skills meant survival. An extra set of hands wasn't necessarily a bad thing, if he could be trusted. Before he could answer, a noise echoed outside. A sharp, distant bang. A gunshot. The three of them tensed. Lucy rushed to the window, peering through a crack in the boards. "Shit," she muttered. Connor joined her. In the distance, figures moved through the streets. But they weren't walkers. They were armed. A group of 5, dressed in mismatched survival gear, rifles slung across their backs. Their movements were controlled, organized. They weren't scavengers. They were hunters. Jackson cursed under his breath. "Great. Runners." Connor clenched his jaw. He had heard about groups like this, survivors who didn't just fight the undead. They hunted other people for their supplies. "We need to lay low," Lucy whispered. Connor nodded. "Nobody moves. Nobody makes a sound." Down below, the group stopped near the grocery store where Connor had found Lucy. One of them, a tall man in a black jacket, knelt and touched the pavement. Tracking. Then, he stood up and looked directly toward their building. Connor's stomach dropped. "We've got a problem," he muttered. The hunters had found their trail. And they were coming. Connor's pulse pounded as he watched the armed group advance. Their leader, the man in the black jacket, signaled to the others, pointing toward the street below. "They know someone's been through here," Lucy whispered. Jackson tightened the bandage on his arm. "We need to go. Now." Connor shook his head. If we run, they'll see us. Lucy glanced at him. And if we stay? They'll search the building, he admitted. We need a plan. Jackson peeked through the boarded window. They don't know exactly where we are. If we stay quiet, they might move on. Connor wasn't so sure. These weren't random scavengers. They were disciplined, moving with a purpose. Then, the leader spoke, his voice carrying through the streets. We know you're out there. Lucy's breath hitched. The man took a slow step forward. We're not looking for trouble. Just supplies. If you've got extra, we can trade. No need for violence. Connor clenched his fists. That was a lie. Jackson whispered, they're feeling us out. Seeing if we'll take the bait. Nobody moved. After a few seconds, the leader exhaled loudly. All right. If that's how you want to play it, search the buildings. Connor's stomach dropped. The group split up, 2 heading toward the grocery store, 2 toward a gas station, and the leader, along with another man, making their way toward the hardware store below them. They're coming, Lucy whispered. Connor's mind raced. They couldn't fight 5 trained men, not without guns. Jackson's eyes darted around the room. Back exit? Connor shook his head. Not without making noise. Lucy scanned the apartment. Then we hide. Connor glanced at the closet. Small, but an option. Under the bed, 2 exposed. Then, he spotted the access panel in the ceiling. He pointed. Attic crawlspace. Lucy nodded. Go. Jackson climbed onto the table first, pushing the panel open. Dust rained down. He hauled himself up, then reached for Lucy. She grabbed his arm and pulled herself inside. Connor went last, just as the sound of footsteps echoed downstairs. As he slid the panel back into place, the front door creaked open. Someone was inside. From the attic crawlspace, Connor could barely make out 2 voices. One of them, the leader, spoke first. Looks like someone's been here. Another man shuffled through the room. Could be old. A pause. The sound of a can rolling across the floor. No, the leader muttered. It's fresh. Connor held his breath. Next to him, Lucy's grip tightened around her crowbar. Jackson's fingers hovered near his knife. Below them, footsteps moved toward the window. They were watching us, the second man said. The leader exhaled. Then they're still close. A pause. Check upstairs. Connor's heart pounded. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. Someone was coming. Then, crash. A deafening noise erupted from outside. Gunfire. Screams. The 2 men downstairs cursed. What the hell, the second man shouted. A radio crackled. Boss. We got a situation. The leader growled. Talk to me. Walkers, dozens of them. They came out of nowhere. More gunfire. More screams. Connor didn't hesitate. He shoved the attic panel open and dropped down, landing silently. Lucy and Jackson followed. The 2 hunters in the apartment were distracted, rushing toward the window to assess the chaos outside. Connor grabbed his backpack and whispered, Go. Now. They slipped out the back, careful not to make noise. As they crept into the alley, they caught a glimpse of the street, walkers swarming the hunters. One of them was already down, torn apart by rotting hands. The leader and his remaining men were retreating, firing wildly. Lucy exhaled. That was close. Jackson smirked. Guess we got lucky. Connor wasn't sure. Luck didn't last long in the apocalypse. And something about that horde, it had come too fast. Too sudden. Like it had been driven there. Connor, Lucy, and Jackson kept moving. The alley behind the hardware store reeked of rot, but it was their best escape route. The gunfire and screams behind them faded as the undead swarmed the hunters. Lucy stole a glance back. We should keep our heads down. The gunshots will draw more. Connor nodded, leading them deeper into the ruins of the city. They weaved between abandoned cars, past shattered storefronts, keeping to the shadows. Jackson let out a low chuckle. I can't believe our luck. Those bastards were about to find us, and boom, walkers come running in like a rescue team. Connor didn't respond. That was what had been bothering him. It was too perfect. Walkers didn't just swarm like that unless something attracted them. A loud explosion, fresh meat, or a deliberate trap. He slowed down. Something's not right. Lucy frowned. What do you mean? Connor stopped and turned to face them. The way those walkers appeared, it was too sudden. Almost like they were sent. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Sent? By who? Connor shook his head. I don't know. But I don't believe in coincidences anymore. Lucy glanced around uneasily. The city had been dangerous enough with random undead and desperate scavengers, but if there was something worse lurking in the shadows. We need to get out of the open, she muttered. Connor led them to an old parking garage. It was partially collapsed, but the lower levels were still intact. They slipped inside, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. As they climbed over debris, Jackson sighed. So, let's say you're right. Let's say someone did send those walkers. Why? And how? Connor scanned the darkened garage. That's what I want to find out. Lucy tensed. Guys, we're not alone. Connor followed her gaze to the far end of the garage. A figure stood in the shadows, motionless. For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then, the figure stepped forward. A woman. She was wearing a hooded coat, her face partially obscured. But her stance was calm, unlike a starving survivor or a desperate scavenger. She lifted her hands, showing she wasn't armed. You got away, she said simply. Connor's grip tightened on his knife. And you were watching. The woman nodded. I was. Jackson scoffed. You the one who sent those walkers? The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head. You don't belong with the dead. So I made sure you had a chance to survive. Lucy narrowed her eyes. Why? The woman took a step closer, just enough for them to see her face, sharp features, dark eyes, the look of someone who had seen too much. Because the real threat isn't the undead, she said. It's them. Connor felt a chill run down his spine. The hunters weren't the worst thing out here. And whatever was coming next. They weren't ready for it. Connor studied the woman, his grip on his knife unwavering. What do you mean the real threat isn't the undead? He asked. The woman's gaze was steady. It's the ones who sent those hunters after you. Lucy shifted uncomfortably. They were just another group of raiders. The woman shook her head. No. They were scouts. The real force is bigger, better armed, and more organized than any raiders you've seen. Jackson exhaled. Great. And here I was thinking the apocalypse couldn't get worse. Connor's mind raced. If this woman was telling the truth, they weren't just running from some small-time scavengers. They were being hunted. Who are they? He asked. The woman hesitated before answering. They call themselves the Dominion. Lucy frowned. Never heard of them. You wouldn't have, the woman said. They don't leave loose ends. Jackson scoffed. And let me guess, you're some kind of rebel fighting against them? The woman smirked slightly. Something like that. Connor wasn't convinced. And why should we trust you? The woman reached into her coat, slowly, making sure they didn't take it as a threat, and pulled out a small notebook. She handed it to Connor. He flipped it open. Inside were names. Dozens of them. Next to each name were notes, locations, status updates, sometimes just a single word, taken. Connor frowned. What is this? The people they've captured, the woman said. They don't just kill. They take survivors. And those who don't join them. She trailed off, but Connor didn't need her to finish. Lucy clenched her jaw. And you think they're coming for us? The woman nodded. I don't think. I know. Jackson let out a humorless chuckle. Awesome. Love the sound of that. Connor closed the notebook. Why are you helping us? The woman's expression darkened. Because I lost people to them. Good people. And I don't intend to let them win. Connor glanced at Lucy and Jackson. They were tough, smart, survivors, but if they were up against something bigger than just zombies and scavengers, they needed to be prepared. He looked back at the woman. What's your name? She hesitated for only a second. Riley. All right, Riley, Connor said. If they're coming, what do we do? Riley exhaled. We move. Now. A distant boom shook the air. Jackson's eyes widened. What the hell was that? Riley's face was grim. Them. Burning the city. Flushing out survivors. Connor felt his stomach drop. They weren't just being hunted. They were being herded. And the only way to survive was to fight back. The fire spread fast. Smoke curled through the streets, turning the city into a choking labyrinth of ash and death. Connor, Lucy, Jackson, and Riley ran through the ruins, keeping low as flames swallowed buildings behind them. They're burning everything, Lucy coughed. They want us out in the open, Riley said. Easier to pick us off. Jackson wiped sweat from his brow. So what's the plan? Because running through fire isn't my idea of a good time. Connor scanned the streets. They had two options, keep running and hope to escape the Dominion's reach, or make a stand before they were caught. We find high ground, he said. Somewhere defensible. Riley nodded. There's an old radio tower near the east side. If we make it there, we can send a signal. I have people listening. Connor didn't ask how many. Right now, any help was better than none. Then we move, he said. The last fight. The radio tower was intact but rusting, standing tall against the burning skyline. It had a chain-link fence around it, barely holding back a horde of walkers pressed against the wire. Guess we're not the only ones who thought of this place, Jackson muttered. Riley pulled a flare from her pack. Get ready. She cracked it, tossing it down an alleyway. The bright red light and smoke drew the undead like moths to a flame. As the walkers turned, the group sprinted through the gate, barricading it behind them. Inside, the tower was eerily quiet. Rusted equipment, old radios, and broken monitors littered the place. Riley rushed to the control panel. I just need a minute. They didn't have a minute. Gunfire cracked from outside. Connor peeked through a window. The Dominion had arrived, 5 men, armed and closing in. They found us, he said. Lucy gritted her teeth. We hold them off. Jackson grabbed a crowbar. Guess we see how many we can take with us. Connor took position behind an overturned desk, his knife ready. Lucy had her crowbar, Jackson had a wrench, and Riley was still working frantically at the radio. The first shot shattered the window. Then the fight began. The first hunter kicked down the door. Connor lunged, slashing his knife across the man's throat. He gurgled, dropping his rifle. Lucy swung hard at another, cracking his skull. Jackson tackled a third, slamming his head against the wall. But more were coming. Then, a static-filled voice crackled through the radio. Riley? She grabbed the mic. We're under attack. Need extraction now. The voice responded. Hold tight. We're inbound. Riley turned to Connor. We just need to survive a little longer. Connor wiped blood from his face. Then let's make sure we do. The escape. The Dominion pushed harder. Bullets shattered wood and metal. Walkers, drawn by the noise, slammed against the fence outside. The group was trapped between two deadly forces. Then, a distant thud. A helicopter. Spotlights cut through the smoke as the aircraft descended over the tower. The Dominion looked up, just as gunfire rained down from above. Riley's people had arrived. A rope ladder dropped from the chopper. "Go! Go!" Riley shouted. Jackson climbed first, then Lucy. Connor waited, covering Riley as she scrambled up. A Dominion soldier rushed in. Connor drove his knife into the man's chest before grabbing the ladder. As they lifted off, the tower erupted in flames below. Walkers swarmed the last of the Dominion forces, tearing them apart. Connor looked down at the burning city. They had survived. But the fight wasn't over. Riley turned to them. This was just the beginning. Connor clenched his fists. He was ready for whatever came next. The end, for now.